Dr. Walsh is currently the Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives and Chief Strategy Officer at Hawaii Pacific University. Before moving into university administration, she was a professor of political science at Azusa Pacific University for over 10 years, where she taught courses on American government and state and local politics. With an MA in politics and a PhD in political science from the Claremont Graduate University, her research interests span a variety of political topics. She is the author of Three Strikes Laws, published by Greenwood Press in 2007, and has also published peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on topics related to higher education, criminal justice policy, constitutional law, political philosophy, and American politics. Dr. Walsh is regularly consulted by print and broadcast media on a range of topics related to local, state, and national affairs, and she is a frequent guest on Australian broadcast companies' news programs, speaking to audiences in Sydney, Australia about American politics. Please welcome Dr. Jennifer Walsh. Well, welcome to Hanging at the Reef, Jennifer. It's great to have you with us today. We are excited to talk politics leading into the election. I imagine you are excited as well.
Absolutely. So thanks for having me on, Jeff. And it's great to be with the HPU community here to talk about politics. This is my very favorite time of year. Every 4 years, we get to decide who's going to be in that top office across, and leading the nation, hopefully in a united fashion for the next 4 years. And of course, I know we'll spend a few minutes talking about if that's really even possible anymore, given the state of affairs. But it is an exciting time. If nothing else, it reminds us that we are a we the people system. We depend heavily on voter participation, voter engagement to set the direction for the country, if not for the next 4 years, then certainly for the next couple of years as we head into every 2-year cycle for congressional elections.
Well, I imagine that you are quite in demand right now. I know you do some appearances on ABC News in Australia, and you're going to be commenting with the local media on the election next Tuesday. So your expertise is greatly in demand, and I'm glad that we have a little bit of it here to have a thoughtful conversation. So let me ask you, my first question is, when you think about today's political climate heading into the election, how would you define the political climate, and what do you see as the defining issues in this election cycle compared to previous years?
That's a great place to start. I mean, I think what we're continuing to see in this election cycle is concern about divisiveness across our country. There seems to be little that we agree upon as Americans. And certainly when you look at some of the advertising, the campaigning, on both sides, you see quite a bit of negative rhetoric, which is not terribly unusual for a presidential campaign, especially in the last home stretch, if you will, the last few days before Election Day. But I think the rhetoric has become increasingly personalized. The attacks are getting sharper. Both sides are, getting into what I would call personality or personal-based attacks against what normally would have been in the past a dispute over or policy or political direction of the country. So it's becoming really individualized, really personalized. And then of late, you're getting elements of gender, race, ethnicity, economics, creeping into the conversation, which makes it more and more difficult to step back after the election and try to find bridges to the other side. And I think of all things, that to me is the most concerning, is that in order to be effective in governing, both sides are going to have to figure out how to work together. And that's been harder to do so in the last couple of cycles, simply because the rhetoric has become so sharp and so pointed. And it's hard for the other side to perhaps look beyond that and to find a way to build unity.
It's interesting that it seems like we've kind of evolved, maybe some might say devolved, to a world where it's really money that drives politics, and we measure, the success or the credibility of a candidate based on how much money they've raised, as an example. So it seems like, a lot of the money that's being raised is for advertising and promotion, winning the news cycles. And that's been a big topic of conversation the last few weeks, is who's winning the news cycles, and is that all that really matters? For example, we've seen a conscious effort from the Trump campaign to go negative to some degree. And you've heard a lot of commentary from media the last few weeks about, vulgarity and commentary and other things that are really meant just to win the news cycle for that week. Has it really just kind of come down to which candidate can be more present in a given week's news cycle as to which one is perceived as having the edge at the moment?
Yes and no. I think for the average American voter, these are not your political news junkies. These are not people who subscribe to the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or their local flagship paper. They're probably paying less attention to that and more attention to, which story has gone viral on their social media channels, which may or may not be influenced by some of the big money campaign initiatives happening on both sides. Certainly, we have, tracked over the years the influence of money early in a race, where it can help to winnow out at the primary level who's ultimately going to secure the nomination for a party. At this general election stage, though, because so many states are not being bombarded with advertising because they're either solidly in the Democratic camp or solidly in the Republican camp, the money has been filtered into what we would call swing states. And these are states where the race is virtually a dead heat between the two parties, the two candidates. And so the 1 or 2% of the voter population that at least has not said publicly who they're voting for is where all of the money and the attention and the news stories are being focused. So you're hearing a lot about Pennsylvania these days, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Georgia at the presidential level, Nevada. These are because those states are really too close to call. And so any slight movement in persuading one voter or another to change sides or to finally commit to a particular candidate is where all the money and the effort in advertising is going to. So whether or not it's reaching, I would say the average voter, the traditional news stories and the political news cycle may or may not matter in the end. It's really around that word of mouth, the talking to your neighbor, seeing who's posting on Facebook or Instagram or True Social or X, who's being the most influential at a given time. The other thing too, we haven't really seen until just recently is the influence of early voting. So this has been a trend that we've monitored, of course, the last couple of cycles. But now we're setting records for how many voters have already cast ballots, in some cases 45 days before the election day is even scheduled. And what that means, any late breaking news, the October surprises that happened even in 2016 with some of the revelatory tapes that were uncovered about then candidate Trump. None of that is happening now because one, there's not the same incentive to do a last minute push because so many voters are voting early. And two, the impact is really going to be muted because by now, if people haven't sent in their ballots, they've at least pretty much made up their mind how they're going to vote. And it just comes down to a matter of logistics. So it'll be interesting to see when we do the tallies of early voters versus same day voters, if there are trends that future cycles can use to predict the outcome. But for now, we're not seeing the same traction around last minute news stories that perhaps we would have 20, 24, 30 years ago, where everything was focused on driving the vote on election day.
Do you think that's because, voters are just in their camps at this point and there's so few people that are undecided?
I would think that's exactly right. So if the one consistent theme we're seeing is that the partisan divide has only strengthened over the last couple of presidential election cycles. This idea that you would evaluate each candidate on the merits and the policies they were proposing, the outreach efforts they were doing to address voter concerns. I think much of that has gone by the wayside. Really, people are becoming hardened in their partisan identification. We've known for decades that partisan ID drives most of the voting at the presidential level. And so therefore, to have fewer people in that undecided middle category to try to persuade means that once more, we're looking at almost a dead heat. The country is pretty evenly divided, at least on the popular vote level, between Democrats and Republicans in terms of party ID. Each state, though, has its own different configuration, and that's why those states that are truly in the middle are becoming all the more influential in determining the outcome. We can talk about electoral college later if we have time, but that may be a whole nother podcast on its own, just simply because the original system as it was constitutionally designed seems to have lost some of the original intent for impact and what it was trying to accomplish. I'm not gonna, go out and say we should abolish it, but I do think it's something we need to take a look at reforming, just because so many voters find themselves completely disenfranchised because candidates are not paying attention to them. They're going simply for those, half a dozen or dozen states where the voting ID breakdown is almost even between the two major parties.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if this is truly the new norm or if we're just in sort of an anomaly stage because of the uniqueness of perhaps Trump as a candidate and the Republican Party's point of view about his candidacy. But you called out, swing states being the key. I think if we look back at the prior two election cycles, Hillary Clinton won 2016 in the popular vote by roughly 2%, I think it was. And I think Biden roughly 4%. And when you look at national polls, the sort of the word on the street is that Harris needs to be up by 4+ points if she's going to carry enough of the national popular vote to trickle down into the swing states. But it seems interesting because all of the polls seem to show a dead heat, a statistical dead heat within a 4 to 5% margin of error, which all syncs up with that historical trend. So when you think about polling today, I know there's a lot of skepticism about the accuracy of polls. And there's a lot of people who, claim, hey, I've never been asked, for my opinion in a poll. And I think statistics have shown that there's less than a 2% response rate to polling. So, in your opinion, how accurate are polls really? And should we be paying this much attention to them?
I think it serves as a proxy in some cases for how the country is feeling about a particular candidate or about a particular incumbent. But I think as a predictive measure, it's definitely lost its power. The way I'm thinking about it, and in the listeners here who are, let's say, older than 35 might be familiar with this term, but to me, it seems a lot like the Nielsen ratings, where we would try to judge the popularity of a TV show based upon viewership. And that, of course, would drive ad revenue for the following season for TV stations to fund their programming. Well, you could do that even in the cable age, when the majority of viewers were tuning into what I would call network programming for their prime entertainment. But of course, with the advent of so many subscription services, viewership has been fragmented across so many different channels and subscriptions and markets and demographics. It's almost impossible to say what's the leading drama, captivating American viewer audiences today. You talk to 14 different people and you're probably going to get 14 different answers. And I think the same is true to a lesser extent, perhaps, when it comes to political polling. We have a proliferation of communication mechanisms, texting, phone calling, landlines, mobile lines. Some people are going off the grid completely. Others are doing a variety of combination of things. So it's difficult to say, one, how do you reach a prospective audience? Two, how do you get them into engage when it's so easy just to reply, stop? I don't know about you, but my text phone, because some of my numbers still align with prior states that I've lived in. I'm getting the text messaging all the time saying, take this poll, take this survey. Of course, it's not scientific. It's usually from a lobby or interest group that wants to demonstrate they want to get me on a mailing list and then, ask me for money, I'm sure. But even just those mechanisms, it's easy to opt out. It's people for not to engage. They're not going to pick up the phone. We know anyone under age 40 probably is not going to answer a phone call from someone they don't recognize in their contact group. And so just getting a sense of how to reach people is becoming more challenging. And then the scientific aspect, which requires random sampling in order to yield any kind of predictive results, becomes all the more challenging on the back end. So I think, not to say that polling is dead, but I think as a predictive measure, what we're seeing are the limits of accuracy. And I personally wouldn't go out and say, based upon polling data, so-and-so is going to win handily. Every so often someone will do that and it typically doesn't work out well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes you think that if all polls for the most part are saying, 4 to 5% margin of error, and almost all of the swing state races are, basically 50-50 within that margin of error, there's just no way to have any insight. And it makes me think, okay, there's no value to polling right now at all, just given how, to some degree, equally divided the voting public is. I won't say the overall population, because I think many would say that the Republican Party is a minority party in the country in terms of total membership. But when you boil it down to who votes in this country, it's really a 50-50 split between the party affiliations. Are there any groups that you feel are truly underrepresented today in polling?
I think we've tried to cover the major demographic voters. I mean, typically, the younger age voters are not well sampled, in part because they don't subscribe to the things that would give us contact information. So it's difficult to know who they are, much less reach them. So typically, the younger demographic is historically undercounted and under represented in those samples, where older voters who subscribe to your traditional news sources, they're the ones to register to vote, usually early enough to be included in polling samples, are going to be oversubscribed. And we see that too now. A lot of the polling agencies have moved away from what used to be the gold standard, which is registered voters. These are voters who have indicated through their self-initiated efforts, I'm interested in this election. I've registered to vote. My registration is current. That, of course, is all on file with public official, clearinghouses, and therefore available for sampling for polling companies later on. But most now rely on what we call likely voters. And so they'll take a look at age, income, educational levels, region of the country, whether or not there's, a lot of political activity that would drive interest in a campaign, to come up with a sample size. And that may or may not be accurate. You could be, in the likely voter category and have no intention of voting, or so turned off by what you're seeing on the constant barrage of TV and radio and social media ads that you just have checked out completely. Or you could be in an area and you're very motivated to vote, and yet you're not included because you don't fall into one of those typical voter demographic groups. So I think the polling companies are trying to adjust for that. But given what you mentioned before, how close the divide is in some of these swing states, I think right now you have Trump up by 0.1, 0.2% of the vote in a swing state. In some areas, Harris is up again, 0.2, 0.3. And when it comes down to a likely margin of error of 3 to 4%, it's anyone's call. And I think that is the message that hopefully people are taking away from this conversation and others they may be having. It's not too late. If you're still motivated to make a difference in this election, it's not too late, and your vote does in fact count. We know from previous races, sometimes in the case of, you might remember, the Gore versus George W. Bush race, it came down to like less than 400 voters in Florida out of a huge state. That was the basis for that electoral decision. So every vote does matter. And if anything, it should help to re-enfranchise people who are feeling somehow left out, or their vote doesn't matter. It actually does. I would say even in the solid red, solid blue states, your vote is paid attention to. And I think for the candidates, you saw a little bit of this in the last month, where the campaign messaging pivoted a bit. You might remember that President Trump came out and softened his rhetoric around an abortion ban. I would say much to the dismay of some, very, very strong pro-life evangelical voters who had been consistent in their support for him, because previously he had been supportive of an abortion ban and judicial appointments that would support and overturn a Roe versus Wade. But I think, I'm speculating because I don't have any insider information here, but some of the state level polling data, even in the more conservative swing states, were showing that a total ban was not a popular position. And so you saw some walking back of that rhetoric, even to the extent of disagreeing publicly with his VP pick, who had already come out in support of a national ban. So that's
And
one
his wife,
example.
for that matter.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Right. So you see some of this last minute pivoting, and I'm just again speculating, but I suspect that it's because as they were getting deeper into the polling data, they were finding that that was not trending well with the voters they really need to count on for support in order to win those swing states. On the Democratic side, we saw some of that with the Israel versus Gaza division coming through for progressives. As you know, the attacks by Hamas on Israel now over a year ago have lengthened that conflict. It's now spreading regionally in the Mideast. There's obviously a humanitarian crisis happening in parts of the world, and that was causing a lot of angst and conflict and turmoil within the Democrats. And so when Biden was the front runner, you know, he was trying to navigate that. And now that Harris, I would say there was I don't know that it was all that successful. I don't think anyone was really feeling satisfied by the road he was trying to carve. Harris has tried to broker that, and it may or may not work. I mean, I don't know that anyone's happy with some of the compromise language that she's using. And certainly those constituency groups have very strong feelings. Just like the abortion issue for the Republicans, it's hard to find compromise grounds on things that people hold to be morally and ethically dear.
You know, you mentioned younger audiences being an undercounted or underrepresented group in terms of polling. This is an interesting election, and one would think, given the issues at hand, that you would see historically high turnout of women, young people engaging in the election process with all of the political dynamics that are reaching engaged Gen Zers and millennials that have reached, you know, voting age. Do you think that those underrepresented populations are significant enough to have enough of an impact on this where the election may not even be close in the end because those groups are not being counted to their full extent?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I think what we're going to see is that young people perhaps don't feel the same overall enthusiasm for this election that perhaps we saw when Obama first ran. And you know, now I'm going to date myself, right? Remember when Bill Clinton was a candidate, it really captivated the younger demographic. He was going on late night TV. He was doing things
Playing
that
that
were
saxophone, the
not
comeback
traditional,
kid,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So again, I know anyone under the age of, you know, old like us, you know, they're not going to remember that, but it was a kind of a significant watershed event in that it was a first attempt to really appeal to that younger demographic. And certainly we're seeing both sides wanting to go after that vote, but it's not, I would say the enthusiasm is a little bit more muted. First of all, both of the candidates are, you know, not of a generation that millennials in particular would adhere to. JD Vance, I think, was an attempt to try to appeal to millennials. Unfortunately, that just didn't seem to resonate the way Republicans had hoped. Perhaps it will change in the future, but at least for right now, it hasn't seemed to move the needle on his favorability rankings. And I think it may not be until we have a true millennial age candidate, both either at the presidential level or the VP level with broad appeal, that you'll see that enthusiasm channeled once more towards national politics. And I have mixed feelings about that. On the one hand, you know, it's going to be historic first for whomever wins. We're either going to have, you know, the return of President Trump being the you know, oldest candidate sworn into office in January, or you're going to have you know, an incumbent Madam President for the very first time with Kamala Harris. So it's going to be historic no matter what the outcome is. But I don't know that it's going to be enough of a historic differential to motivate people who are just kind of now apathetic about it. They're frustrated perhaps, or they're just tuning out because they don't see any relevance for themselves. And the one thing that I was curious, perhaps because Harris jumped into the race as a replacement candidate so very late, she never fleshed out really a policy level blueprint. And President Trump has not done so either, right? So they've really focused on broad themes. They've focused on general kind of philosophical approaches to governing, but none of the same, I don't know, say policy wonky stuff that have characterized some of the more recent presidential campaigns. And maybe that's better for young people who, don't necessarily feel particularly motivated by a discussion around Social Security policy or an expansion of Medicare or a prescription drug benefit. It doesn't affect them, probably doesn't even affect their parents yet. If it affects their grandparents, that's, so many degrees removed from their personal consideration. It may or may not resonate with them in the way that it would with an older demographic.
Yep. It almost seems that the individual platform of the candidates is irrelevant today. That whatever they say in terms of, policy proposals or platforms that they're pursuing, that the voting public is so entrenched in the belief of what the platforms of each party are, that
Yeah.
a candidate can't change that. Republicans are, perceived as, small government, not supportive of social welfare programs. And even if a Republican candidate comes out in support of Social Security, it just seems like people's perspectives are so baked into what they view as the political party platforms that almost the candidate matters less.
Yeah.
And is that what you're seeing, where candidates can't break through anymore with an idea that breaks the perceived mold of what the party itself stands for?
I think Trump has been able to be more effective at that. If you go back and look at what conservative voters and conservative candidates were espousing back before he was a primary nominee in 2016, it was very much the same things that you mentioned: small government, low taxes, fiscal restraint, kind of, pro-business, pro-family. And, he's definitely mixed things up a little bit in terms of his policies around that he's, at least is publicly stating around immigration and taxes. And it's much more a populist agenda that has resonated with the GOP under the Trump administration and subsequent years than I think it would have ever before. There were elements of that. And so he tapped into something that obviously proved to be very successful, but it had not risen to the level of kind of partisan platform. And I will say, I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I think it's important for voters to understand how a future president would respond in the case of congressional negotiations around a significant bill, or in the case of international conflict, what their position and philosophy might be, or what they might do when a judicial vacancy arises. But it used to give me a fair degree of heartburn every time I would listen to presidential candidates talk about the policies that they would implement. And of course, I'm thinking constitutionally, you cannot do that. You don't have the authority to do it. It's Congress that really drives the policy making for, like it or not. Article 1 of the Constitution talks about Congress is the one, specifically the House is the one that sets tax policy. And it's, Congress that was the star of the Constitution. The president was, a secondary player, an important one, but certainly not the star of the show. And so to see that the president candidates today are not promoting, well, here's what I would do if you elect me, and making promises that honestly they would not have full authority to keep, is a little bit, I don't want to say refreshing, but I think it's a little bit more honest. It's a little bit more reflective of reality. Now, nonetheless, if we're not going to get policies accomplished through presidential, whether it be executive orders or presidential intervention or direct negotiating with members of Congress, then the voters should be scrutinizing then how their elected officials are in fact responding to their individual and collective needs, because that's what they're there for. They are supposed to be the drivers of public policy. And if they're not being fully responsive, then that's where our system needs to refocus its priorities and attention.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about Congress. I think, stewards of our political system would say that, we've been experiencing gridlock for quite a while now, where it doesn't matter which party is in control of the White House. If there's split among Congress, nothing gets done. The House won't pass something, or if they do pass something, the Senate won't approve it. So how do you see things potentially changing in this election? Or do you envision that we're going to continue to have gridlock because we're going to have divided government? Whichever party wins the White House, there's a strong probability that we'll have a split in Congress, with perhaps the Democrats retaking control of the House and the Republicans taking control of the Senate, which means that we might have 4 more years of political gridlock.
So looking through this last congressional period, which is the last 2 years, we've actually been able to pass more legislation than the average voter might recognize. So a lot of it has to do with funding, continuous resolutions, while now kind of a consistent part of our budget cycle for federal governments. Eventually the funding does get passed. Military get paid, federal employees get paid, students get their financial aid packages through, maybe sometimes delayed, but they do get through. And so, we are able to accomplish some of the day-to-day work on governing. What I think we're missing, though, is a real sense of leadership, of where Congress is coming together in a bipartisan fashion to tackle some of the big issues of the day. So we know with an aging population, there's continuous scrutiny around the continuity of Social Security benefits for people who are the next in the wave to retire. The national debt continues to resurface every now and then as a source of concern. 35 trillion now is the running total, and it's growing every day. That used to be a big deal in the past. Perhaps it's not been a priority, perhaps because members of Congress know that trying to find bipartisan consensus perhaps could be futile. So I think those bigger issues, but nonetheless, that day is going to come perhaps when we may not have enough funding on a regular basis to fully cover the costs of all of the things that we want to cover. And yet there seems to be no desire or motivation to really tackle some of these longstanding pressures. Immigration is a thorny topic. Everybody is, I think, afraid to really tackle that. The last time, it's been about probably 25 years since there was a bipartisan effort to try to once and for all come up with a workable immigration strategy that addresses both documented and undocumented workers that the country relies upon for much of its labor force. And as we are reaching kind of domestic population peak pretty soon, I think it would behoove us all to have some serious, sober-minded conversations about how are we going to handle our economy if the population continues to decline domestically. That's a difficult conversation. I don't know that we are at a place right now in the country where we've got enough political will on either side to drive that conversation. And of course, we know how fraught it is with kind of the emotional responses, that it could be just not the right time. But nonetheless, it's an important issue. And I'm hoping at some point in the future, not too distant future, we'll have the congressional buy-in to roll up the sleeves and really tackle it.
How do you see the presidential election influencing down ballot races this year? Is it going to be consistent, do you think, as in prior elections where, lines by party, or do you see a lot of departures where perhaps those that are frustrated with Trump, that are, more conservative Republicans, might not vote for the Republican at the top of the ticket, but then vote down ballot for all of the Republican offices at, the Senate, congressional levels, and down below for local office?
That's a great question. The non-voter is one that we won't fully know until after the election's over, and we can analyze then, who did that very thing, who just skipped that top office and went right down to congressional and local elections and cast a vote for them. Typically, though, when you think what drives voter behavior, it's often that top ticket getter, right? It's the person at the top of the ballot. That's going to motivate them to take off work, to show up at the polling place, wait in line, or to spend time over the weekend or in the evening, filling out the ballot and sending it in. And often what happens is you'll get those first couple of top races where there's lots of name recognition, lots of activity and interest. And by the time you get down to, city council members, dog catcher, local magistrate, people just say, forget it. And they're done. They're going to just call it a day. Now, in the case of some of the congressional races, this could be really significant if voters are just so frustrated and apathetic with the tenor and tone of the campaigns that they just opt out altogether. We know that some of those same swing states that will determine the president race are also going to tip the balance one way in favor of the Senate. So Nevada is too close to call. Wisconsin's too close to call. Ohio's too close to call. Michigan's too close to call. These are races that also show up on the too close to call for the Electoral College. So if you have a late breaking movement or in the early voter ballots are cast already for one or the other candidates, it likely will determine then what that Senate balance will look like. And of course, with the Senate currently being narrowly held by Democrats, any change to Republican control, especially if the House remains Republican, you would have unified government if Trump were also to win. That could, in fact, move some of the conservative agenda very, very quickly in a way that wouldn't have otherwise been possible.
Well, early returns on vote by mail have indicated their historic highs in terms of Americans voting by mail, and early statistics have for exit polling for the mail-in vote have indicated almost like a 2-to-1 margin for Democrat versus Republican. Now, I'm sure that varies by state, but that would really indicate that the Democratic Party is doing well with early turnout for mail-in votes, and we've seen that in prior elections as well. And then for day of election, you see strong Republican turnout, so they balance each other out. Do you see those trends continuing this year?
I do. And there's often an economic reality to those patterns where you don't have to take, if you're an hourly worker, if you're in a union a position that doesn't have election day as a holiday, trying to get time off of work, travel to a polling site that may not be close to home or work to stand in line to cast a ballot just may not be possible for some who are in the lower socioeconomic groupings. Where if you are a salaried employee that's an exempt category to take a morning or afternoon off to go cast your vote doesn't have the same economic repercussions. We see the same thing in jury duty and jury service, right? That those who can afford to take the time off to engage in civic processes are often at a higher economic ranking, and that could in fact skew some of those returns when we evaluate in-person versus mail-in. Now, we know that there's enough popular vote among socioeconomic classes that have been historic in the Democratic camp, now shifting over to the Republican camp, that prior trend may not bear any fruit for in this year's analysis. But it's just something to keep mindful of as we're analyzing those early returns. The other thing that I have not seen covered, and I'm just going to throw it out there for fun, is what the early voting by mail does for our commitment to a secret ballot. So if you remember the secret ballot was introduced about a little over 100 years ago as a way to break some of the strong economic monopolistic control over elections, because you used to have to vote publicly according to a partisan ballot, and many times they were color coded. So if you had a blue ballot, you were voting one way. You had a green ballot, you were voting another. And so just by asking for which ballot, you signaled publicly who you were voting for, and the only candidates on that particular ballot aligned with one party. So there was no mixture of party candidates on a single ballot. So the Australian ballot or the secret ballot system was an attempt to kind of return control back to the people so they didn't have to worry about losing their job or losing their political appointment if they were a low-level political public servant. By having that ballot, in that voting booth, when it's you in the paper, having it sent to homes, there's now a whole dynamic of voting around family behaviors that I think will be interesting to watch. So if you have an 18, 19, 20-year-old living at home, does that person have full freedom if it, becomes like, hey, you're living in our house, we're all voting this way, we're going to fill out our ballots together? I'm speculating, maybe this is not happening at all. Or husbands and wives, that dynamic, especially in more, I would say, conservative, patriarchal, conventional marriage relationships. It could certainly have some influence there. I don't know. I'm just, again, speculative, but I'd love to see some follow-up analysis to tease out any trends around if, say, an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old voting at home through early ballot looks any different than someone who shows up at the polls, or vice versa on the marital relationship, or elderly people, whatever. Yeah, fill in the blank.
That will be so interesting to see. And I know if you look at historical research, it would indicate that, traditionally children, for example, would align more with the politics of their parents. They would follow in their footsteps. And I think when you look back through prior generations, you saw strong correlations of young people aligning with the political views of their household. And to your point, I wonder if that holds true today. You look at, issues of the day, the Palestinian-Israeli question, for example, and you see a lot of young people breaking from, the perspective perhaps that their parents have of strong support for Israel versus younger people supporting the Palestinian point of view. So you see these departures starting to happen already, and you have to believe that a lot of that is driven by the availability of information, and in some cases, the availability of misinformation. So, what are your thoughts about the impact that misinformation and the seeding of inaccurate stories, from outside influences, whether it be Russia or China, does that continue to have such a strong impact on our elections as I think many people believe it did in 2016 and 2020?
Well, certainly we know that influence is continuing, whether or not voters are any wiser, knowing that this attempt to influence is happening on a regular basis. I'm not sure. Certainly we see the artificial news stories. I hate to use fake news, but let's say artificially generated news stories circulating. And when I was actively teaching in the classroom, I would have my students pause and say, can you find any other independent source to corroborate this story? Because typically, if it's a true, legitimate news story, whether you trust, mainstream media or not, there's usually some independent corroboration to say, there's some elements of truth here that would give some additional veracity to the story. Typically, though, if it's, being propagated by just, sheer propaganda from another, country or another, political group, PAC, if you will, it's going to be difficult or impossible to verify because it's probably not true. And I think, with the invention of generative AI or, the release of generative AI, it's going to be harder to know going forward what video and audio clips, for example, are in fact true. And unfortunately, sometimes you'll get, an artificially inspired news story that then is covered by mainstream media. So it becomes a circular environment where even the most diligent of fact-checking voters might try to figure out on their own, is this true or not? See some mainstream coverage and determine, oh, yes, it must be true because it was picked up in, the local paper or was picked up by one of the national news outlets. So we have to be very careful. And I don't know how this is going to play out, to be honest. Either we're going to become so deafened to the noise that these artificially inspired stories are going to create that we just, don't care anymore, or we're going to double down and say, we're going to, invest in technology that can help suss out the truth versus the non-truth. In order to preserve some element of integrity. I don't know. I mean, that's going to take a lot of work. It'll have to take a lot of collective buy-in. And I suspect that people are just so tired and they figure it's a futile attempt because, we figure out one way to shut down the artificially inspired stories on this channel, and it's just going to pop up elsewhere. It's a little bit like a whack-a-mole game. We knock one down and then four more pop up, which is unfortunate. I think, the loss of trust and any kind of authority, especially as it relates to facts and information, is going to hurt us in the long run. I long for the days before the smartphone. As much as I use it on a regular basis, right? It was harder to spread half truths or partial truths or zero truth stories with the click of a finger. And I think it's just becoming too easy, and people do it without thinking or really spending the time to investigate whether or not what they're sharing is credible or not.
Yeah, I think many of us long for the days pre-smartphone. Life was certainly a lot easier. It's interesting. I makes me think about a meme I saw the other day on a social post. It's something to the effect of, other countries are teaching their kids how to identify false news. Well,
Yeah.
we're trying to bicker over what books we should ban in schools, which I think is kind of indicative of the state here. The thing that occurs to me about the impact of social media and misinformation, particularly on elections, is, you and I have talked in the past about algorithms in social. And if you really think about it, the algorithms that, each person sort of get their content fed from are so unique to your specific situation, your browsing habits, your what do you click on. So it occurs to me that almost none of us can have true visibility into the bubble that someone else lives in because it's
Yeah.
unique to them based on their habits on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or what have you. So it's hard to even have a true understanding of the world that each of us lives in and what we see as news coming at us. And if you don't have those skills to identify fake news or to have a curious intellect and to want to go a little deeper and not just take for granted that what you see in that timeline is accurate and be critical of it, that none of us have a true understanding of how each of us is living in that world. And then when you think about it that way, it doesn't become so surprising to think, well, I get why that person believes what they believe because it's what comes at them every single day in the
Right.
device that they are looking at all day long. Why would you not believe that? And your
Yeah.
friends are getting the same things, and then you're living in your bubble and posting the same sort of content.
Right.
So it becomes real to you, even when it's apparent to somebody else who doesn't live in that bubble that that's a fake news story.
No, I remember going to Washington. Now, this was probably 10 years ago, at a time where there was some congressional deadlock around the budget. And so there was talk about, having employees go on furlough, closing the national parks. We've done this a couple of times, and I don't remember which cycle it was, but it was one of the earlier ones. And there was a lot of hand wringing. And I remember watching the news in Washington when I was there for a conference, an event. And that's all the Washington politicos could talk about. It was incessant, 24/7 is what's going to happen when this government shutdown takes effect. I came back to, at the time I was in California, I came back to California. I was all amped up. I'm like, we got to plan for this. This is disaster, right? I had been in that echo chamber for 2 weeks straight. And I came back, and like even my politically inclined colleagues and friends were like, "What are you talking about? Why are you so anxious about? Like, what's going on?" And I think about that often now when I listen to conversations that are happening on social media channels or sometimes in person, where people are really anxious about something that the other side is oblivious to. They have no idea. Or if they've heard about it, it's like in passing and it doesn't really have any credibility, it doesn't resonate with them. And yet for some of the voters, it's what is keeping them up at night. They're really anxious. They're really fearful about, this particular issue. And I think, one way to do that is just have a broad, network, a circle of friends and family. And I chuckle because I have some family that are very much on one side and other family members are very much on the other. So my social media feeds are kind of amusing at times because, they're posting almost diametrically opposite opinion pieces. And I just kind of chuckle to see the two things play out. But I also think, so one of the sites that I like to point students to is realclearpolitics.com. It's an aggregate site. It's got both a mixture of mainstream news stories as well as opinion articles. And even if you don't get into the actual articles itself, you can see just from the content that's posted, and they typically aggregate from some of the more reputable and popular sources. You can just see the framing. And I think that's helpful to understand that your lens that you're looking through a particular issue may not be as monolithic as you think it is when you just simply look and see how it's being interpreted or framed by the candidates on the other side. So that doesn't mean it's persuasive or that there's enough, information to get someone to change their mind, but just being aware that often what you are seeing in your news feeds is curated based upon your clicks, your viewing habits, your social media networks, and it may not be representative, of course, of the rest of the country.
And I think that in a nutshell is among the biggest reasons why we're at where we're at, because we're all not basing our perspectives off a common set of truths or facts that everybody is hearing. And we live in a world where facts are subjective, and you can pick and choose what you believe in. So no wonders that everybody has different points of view. And then to your point, living in these echo chambers, it's just reinforced day after day after day. So we'll see how long we live in this world, but it's interesting to see, or to think, are we going to break out of this cycle at some point? Or are we stuck at it for the next couple of decades?
Yeah. And, I have, again, mixed feelings. Like most things, there are some benefits. There's also some things that are problematic. I am old enough. I remember when you had just nightly network news. This was before the invention of cable. So CNN didn't exist. Certainly Fox News didn't exist. MSN didn't exist. And so people turned into ABC, CBS, NBC for their nightly news show. And it you got three versions, but it was pretty much the same story. Unfortunately, for some people, what resonated with them or concerned to them if it didn't make that nightly news, coverage, then it was really not paid attention to, at least not in a serious, thorough way. So the democratization of our issues across a much wider segment of the population is one of the benefits of having fewer gatekeepers to keep information bottled up. The downside, of course, is that, with no gatekeepers or few gatekeepers, it's a wild, wild west show out there. And so you get stuff all over the map, and some of it is credible and a lot of it's not. And so it does make it harder for the viewer, the listener, the voter to discern what is trustworthy and what is not. And I'm hoping we the people system. We the people will figure that out and make sure that our democracy stays nice and healthy for the long run.
Wishful thinking, and I think that would be a wonderful thing. Well, Jennifer, this has been a fascinating conversation. And before I let you go, give us the top bellwether, / indicator that you're going to be looking for election night to see, what's going to happen. What's top of your list for the indicators that you're pointed towards?
East Coast polls will close first, of course, and Georgia's one to watch. So Georgia's had a lot of early voter interest and participation. So it may still be too close to call when polls close. But if we start to see very wide margins of victory or defeat emerging for one side or the other, that could be a bellwether, since both candidates have spent a considerable amount of time, money, and energy campaigning in Georgia. So that certainly is emerging as a very important swing state. I think center of the country, we're going to watch Michigan and Wisconsin. Pennsylvania on the East Coast, of course, is one that we anticipate will go down to the wire. But I think once we cover, and I hate to say this for my West Coast friends, but once we cover kind of the Central and East Coast time zones, we'll have a clear indication if this is going to be a weeks-long process to determine by counting every single absentee and early mail-in vote, or if we're going to start to see a trend breaking solidly in favor of one candidate or the other. If so, then the very small differences that might come through at the end by absentee ballot or mail-in votes may not make as much of a difference. So I think probably here in Hawaii time, if we are looking at, say, 5 or 6 o'clock hour, we'll know by then either it's a nail biter that's going to take weeks to determine, or if we're going to have an election winner declared within the next day or so. We should know before we have dinner. So we'll keep an eye on that for sure.
All right. Well, Jennifer Walsh, political science professor, political consultant, we appreciate your time and expertise today, and it's going to be an exciting week next week. We'll see what happens.
Always. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for being with us.